Police now advancing on protesters. Oh my gosh, we're moving.
Oh.
We're moving.
Okay.
Stop. You're good. Go this way.
Let's go.
Threats against journalists increasing nationwide and across the world. But this is nothing new, and we are approaching the November 7th anniversary of the murder of Elijah Lovejoy in 1837. Here to talk about this is Chris Mahin, author and historian. Hey, Chris, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Why don't we start off just by, can you tell us, just give us some background on Lovejoy, who was he, and what was the situation when he was working as a journalist?
Well, Lovejoy was a man who had originally been born in Maine, and he actually walked from Maine to the state of Missouri, where he worked for a time as a journalist. And then he was born in the early 1800s, 1802, and in 1832 he was part of what is known as the Great Awakening, a tremendous period of religious conversions and religious revival in the United States. And he went and became a minister. And in the course of that religious conversion, he ultimately came back to Missouri and became the editor of a newspaper, the St. Louis Observer, and began to increasingly write articles critical of slavery. As a result of that, he had to flee from St. Louis. His printing press was destroyed, and he had to flee from St. Louis across the Mississippi River to southern Illinois, to the town of Alton, Illinois. And he continued to write editorials against slavery, and ultimately he is killed in Alton, Illinois.
So what was the situation that actually led up to his killing?
Well, Lovejoy goes from St. Louis, he moves with his family from St. Louis to Alton, Illinois. And he begins to, originally he was the editor of a newspaper called the St. Louis Observer, and it becomes the Alton Observer, and he begins to publish editorials critical of slavery. Now, this is southern Illinois. Illinois is technically a free state, but that part of Illinois is economically very connected to Missouri and to the South in general, and to the slave owning states in general. And what happens is that some of the city fathers, the respectable people in town, tell him in no uncertain terms that he must stop agitating against slavery. And they hold a protest meeting and they basically threaten him. And at one point they tell him in pretty blunt terms that if he continues this work against this, educating the public against slavery, that he is liable to be killed. And he tells them emphatically, his words are, "My Savior died on the cross for me, and he commands me to preach his gospel that all men should be free." And shortly after that, now what happened is that Lovejoy had one printing press destroyed in St. Louis. Then he moves to Alton, Illinois, and he has on 3 different occasions printing presses destroyed. But yet he persists. He gets new printing presses, and the people who support him raise money for those printing presses. On the night at 3 a.m. on the night of November 7th, 1837, a steamboat unloads a new printing press, and it's brought into a warehouse of a sympathizer of Lovejoy, who's willing to allow this printing press to be placed there. And word gets out, a mob gathers, they begin to throw stones, and then ultimately they attempt to burn down the building. burn down this warehouse. Lovejoy comes out to try and stop a situation where someone's attempting to place a ladder against the building, walk up that ladder and set fire to the roof. So when Lovejoy comes out, shots ring out. He is hit with 5 bullets and he dies. Of those 5 bullets, it's generally considered that 2 of them were fired by doctors, 2 different doctors who were hiding. And Lovejoy's body is taken away, and one of those doctors proceeds to dance a jig in celebration of the death of Elijah Lovejoy.
Wow. So when word of his killing got out, what was the reaction locally and nationally?
Well, this just shocked the conscience of decent people around the country. I mean, if you think of this, I mean, this was really the first time that someone had been explicitly killed because of the editorials that they had written in a newspaper. John Quincy Adams, former President John Quincy Adams, said of Lovejoy that he was the first martyr in America to freedom of the press and the freedom of the slave. And when you think of this image of a man being shot to death by a mob, including doctors, one of whom then dances in celebration. I mean, this just so shocked the conscience of the country that in some respects, it was almost like the George Floyd killing recently. You know, there was just this universal wave of revulsions. There's public meetings that are held in response, and there's also people who defend the killing. And so there's a gigantic debate, but it then leads to a situation where all sorts of new leaders step forward, just as new leaders are stepping forward today. I mean, there is a public meeting of indignation held in Ohio, and a man stands up at the end of the meeting who had said not very much before the end of the meeting, and he holds up his right hand and says, "From this moment forward, I dedicate my life to the abolition of slavery." That man's John Brown. In Boston, there's a meeting at Faneuil Hall, and the Attorney General of Massachusetts tries to defend the killing of Lovejoy and compares the mob to the people in the Boston Tea Party. And this just is greeted with outrage. And Wendell Phillips, who ends up being one of the greatest of the public speakers against slavery, one of the greatest of the abolitionist orators, he stands up and delivers a brilliant refutation of that argument. At the scene where Lovejoy is killed, his younger brother, who's 9 years younger than he is, also dedicates his life to the struggle against slavery. He ends up becoming a leader of the Underground Railroad, a congressman from Illinois, a Republican congressman, friend of Lincoln, is one of the people who pushes Lincoln to take more emphatic positions against slavery. Abraham Lincoln is one of the few public figures from Southern Illinois, who condemns the killing of Lovejoy. So there's just this universal revulsion, certainly in the North. I mean, there are people in the South who defend it, but throughout the North, there's this beginning of a recognition that not only are Black people hurt by slavery, but non-slaves, whites as well, are hurt by the arrogance of the slaveocracy and their refusal to acknowledge the civil liberties of people.
So what other things can we take from Elijah Lovejoy's situation that we should be thinking about today?
Well, I think one of the main lessons of the killing of Elijah Lovejoy is that whenever you have a system, an economic system that's controlled by a tiny handful of people that that system ultimately is going to have to use force. It is going to have to attack people's rights in order to maintain its control. And I think that is a very ominous lesson for today, but one of the most definite lessons. I mean, you look at the situation in 1837, a lot of people thought at that time, a lot of people in the North, that, well, we don't like slavery. They have slavery down there in the South. It's a peculiar institution. It's their Southern way of life, but we can live here in the North. We can be free, and we can have our liberties and our Northern way of life, and we'll just let them have their Southern way of life, and we'll get along, and we'll try to ignore and overlook the horrors of slavery. But what happened was, as the slave system continued, it had to expand into new territory, and it had to defend its expansion. And the result of that was, as people began to oppose its expansion into new territory and began to speak out morally against its outrageous violations of human rights, the slavocracy was compelled to violate the rights not just of the slaves, which they obviously did in total, but they had to do things like prevent petitions against slavery from even being considered by the United States Congress. They had to organize mobs against someone like Elijah Lovejoy. And so the attack on rights, the denial of rights for African Americans under the slave system, ultimately led to a situation where the rights of the whites were also under attack. And I think you can see that today, where you have the complete lack of human rights of the homeless, of the utterly impoverished. But when you have that situation, the people who profit from that, they are ultimately going to have to attack everybody's human rights. And you look today in the situation with the election, where with voter suppression, with political figures egging on attacks on journalists in public meetings, you see the same sort of situation.
Thanks a lot, Chris. I will link an article that you wrote below this video about the significance of Elijah Lovejoy. Are there any other books or resources you would recommend to people to get more about this?
Well, first, thank you for having me. Secondly, in terms of if people want more information about Elijah Lovejoy, and I would really strongly encourage people to read as much as they can about this man, because he's really a heroic figure who hasn't had as much attention brought to him as he really deserves. But the one really good biography that I know of is called Freedom's Champion, and it was written by former U.S. Senator Paul Simon. Simon was actually a newspaper editor in Southern Illinois. He's from Southern Illinois. And because he was a newspaper editor in the same part of Illinois that Elijah Lovejoy died in, he became very interested in the case, and he wrote this full-length biography of Lovejoy, which is quite good, and even at the end quotes some of the editorial comments made by other newspaper editors after Elijah Lovejoy was killed.
All right, I will put a link to that. Thanks a lot, Chris.
Thank you so much.